In the winter of 1944, Belgium felt as if it had been placed beneath a single vast sheet of pale metal. The sky rarely broke into any other color, and the days seemed pressed into a long stretch of gray light that offered neither comfort nor warmth. Snow piled along the edges of the forests in the Ardennes until branches bowed under the weight and creaked with every shift of the wind. The roads that wound through the hills became hardened tracks of frozen mud, shaped and reshaped by the heavy treads of tanks and the endless steps of tired men. The countryside, once known for quiet villages and gentle slopes, had turned into a landscape where the scars of war showed in every shattered tree and gouged hill. It was here that Germany launched its final offensive, the last attempt to turn the war back toward a direction that now existed more in hope than in reality. For a few brief days, German tank columns broke through American lines, and the soldiers marching behind them dared to imagine they were pushing time backward. But the optimism faded almost as quickly as it appeared. The weather cleared, and when the sky opened, American aircraft returned in growing numbers. Their engines filled the valleys with a sound that left no doubt about the balance of strength. Long convoys of supply trucks rolled forward, carrying fuel, ammunition, food, blankets, medical supplies, and countless items that came from factories thousands of miles away. The German soldiers, who had already grown used to rationing their remaining shells and cutting their bread into thin slices, watched these convoys with a sinking awareness that the war was no longer something they could influence. It had grown larger than the men standing in the snow. Across the Atlantic, American production lines glowed through the night. Workers who had never seen a battlefield stamped metal into shapes that would become engines, canteens, helmets, and radio parts. Canneries filled rows of bright tins that would travel across the ocean and into the hands of men who barely had time to taste what they swallowed. On the battlefield, this enormous industrial weight revealed itself in simple and intimate ways. An American soldier's boots stayed dry, while a German soldier's boots cracked at the seams. One man carried thick gloves, another wrapped his hands in worn cloth, one marched with a full stomach, the other tried to ignore the hunger that tightened in his chest. What had once been numbers and reports had now become something that pressed against the skin, settled in the bones, and shaped each day's mood. Among the thousands who surrendered after the offensive collapsed was Friedrich Hollmann, a communications corporal from a quiet town in Lower Saxony. Before the war, he had spent his days repairing radios with his father, who kept a small shop on a cobblestone street where the sound of church bells echoed on Sunday mornings. The shop always carried the faint smell of warm dust, soldering smoke, and metal shavings. Friedrich had grown up believing that the world made sense when a circuit hummed properly, or when a broken dial clicked cleanly into place after repair. He had never imagined that he would be assigned to lay telephone cables under artillery fire or climb wooden poles while hearing gunshots in the distance. Yet that was where the army placed him. He became one of the men who carried coils of wire across fields, fixed antennas in the rain, and tuned field radios, while officers waited impatiently for messages to go through. He had seen battle from a distance, but rarely fired his rifle. The sound of artillery had become familiar, and he learned to feel the difference between a shell that would pass overhead and one that would strike close by. When the offensive crumbled and American patrols approached the edge of the forest where his unit had dug shallow shelters, he saw the last rounds of ammunition vanish from their crates. There was no dramatic decision, no final shout of defiance. There was simply the moment when he and his comrades realized there was nothing more they could do. They raised their hands not out of cowardice, but because continuing to fight would have meant little more than adding their names to a long list of the dead. The march into captivity unfolded like a long and quiet dream. The prisoners were tired, cold, and too worn down to speak much. Friedrich noticed details almost against his will. Beside the column, American trucks rumbled steadily. They were not new machines, but they ran smoothly, and their engines made a confident sound that rose and fell like breath. The truck's exhaust drifted into the winter air in thick white clouds that slowly dissolved into the pale sky. The prisoners' breath, by contrast, hung in the air like thin wisps of frost. Their boots left uneven marks in the snow because some soles had begun to separate, and pieces of cloth had been wrapped around the worst cracks. The guards did not treat them harshly, but the contrast between the two groups was unmistakable. It was as if they walked in two different worlds, one held together by abundance, and the other worn thin by scarcity. After several days, the column arrived at a clearing surrounded by wooden posts and barbed wire. A watchtower stood at each corner, built from simple planks that looked as if they had been erected in haste. Inside the fence were rows of wooden barracks roofed with heavy snow. The light bulbs hanging from wires between the posts glowed faintly as dusk settled over the camp, and their soft light trembled in the wind. This was the camp to which Friedrich and many others were assigned. It had an official designation in the papers that moved through the hands of officers and clerks, but to the men who walked past the gate, the meaning was far more immediate. It was a place with boundaries they could not cross, routines they did not choose, and a future they could not see. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both predictable and difficult. At dawn, prisoners stepped out of their bunks wearing clothes still damp from the night. The guards counted them one by one, their voices steady in the cold. Breakfast was a thin soup and a small piece of bread. Lunch and supper were nearly the same. These rations met the rules established far from the front lines, yet hunger remained like a companion that followed them through the day and lay down beside them at night. Friedrich sometimes listened to the soft sounds around him in the darkness. Someone shifting to escape a draft, someone praying quietly, someone else trying to hold back tears he believed no one should hear. The barracks were filled with men who had walked through fire and snow, only to find themselves surrounded by walls of wood and wire. As December wore on, the atmosphere of the camp shifted in small and almost fragile ways. A cardboard star appeared near the kitchen door, cut with uneven edges but hung with care. A bundle of evergreen branches stood near the medical hut, adding a splash of deep green to the otherwise colorless world one evening. A faint melody drifted down from the nearest watchtower. Someone was humming a Christmas hymn, the kind people sang in warm churches or around candlelit tables. The tune floated across the cold air and settled into the camp like a memory. Some of the prisoners paused to listen. Others kept walking, their faces tightening as if the sound had awakened something they were not ready to feel. The small decorations and the quiet music did not bring joy in a simple way. Instead, they stirred a mixture of longing, sorrow, and warmth, a reminder of families far away and traditions that felt impossibly distant. For Friedrich, the signs of Christmas brought back images he had not allowed himself to remember for months. His mother placing candles in the windows of their home, the smell of sweet bread rising from the oven, his father adjusting the radio to catch a holiday broadcast. These memories were bright but painful, like holding warm embers that glowed in the hand but could not be kept. He understood that many of the men around him felt the same. The holiday had come, but it arrived behind wire and under a sky that seemed as far from peace as any they had ever known. Yet even in this place, where routines were rigid and days blended together, something in the air had changed. No one spoke of it openly, but everyone felt it. As Christmas drew nearer, the camp began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to ignore yet persistent enough that no one truly could. It happened first in the tone of the guards' voices, which seemed a little less sharp than usual, as if the cold air had softened the edges of their words. It appeared in the way some of the American soldiers paused before closing a door or lowered their voices when passing near the barracks after dark. Even the daily routines, though unchanged in substance, carried a faint sense of something slowing down, as if the very rhythm of the place had begun to breathe differently. For the prisoners, these small hints were both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because they suggested that the season still held meaning even behind barbed wire. Unsettling because remembering that meaning stirred emotions that many men had tried hard to push aside. The cardboard star near the kitchen door became a small landmark. Snow settled on its edges and made it sag slightly, yet someone kept brushing it off, straightening it whenever the wind bent it. The evergreen branches near the medical hut remained fresh, their needles releasing a faint scent each time someone walked past. These small gestures were not part of any official regulation. They were simply human acts, done by men who perhaps thought of their own families while performing them. To the prisoners, such details felt almost like messages from another world, one where warmth existed, where families gathered around tables, where music and candlelight replaced hunger and cold. Yet these reminders did not bring a simple lift of the heart. Instead, they spread through the camp like a mixture of warmth and ache, stirring a longing that grew deeper each day. Some prisoners talked about the holidays in low voices at night. Friedrich often lay awake, listening to fragments of sentences that drifted through the darkness. Someone remembering a Christmas spent in a small-town church. Someone else describing the smell of a special dish his mother used to prepare. Another recalling the way snow glowed beneath lanterns on winter nights in his childhood. The stories came out slowly, hesitantly, as if speaking them aloud, risked breaking something fragile. Others chose silence, holding their memories inside because they feared that recalling them too vividly would make the pain sharper. Friedrich felt both impulses. There were moments when he wanted to speak about the warmth of his home, the quiet evenings when his family gathered near the radio, the soft hum of a well-repaired circuit bringing a familiar comfort to the shop. But he also knew that bringing these memories into the dim barracks might make the distance between past and present feel wider than the ocean itself. On the morning of December 25th, the air felt different before anyone realized why. The sky was bright in a pale and colorless way, and a thin mist hovered over the snow, creating a soft blur where the ground met the horizon. When the whistle blew and the prisoners stepped outside, they sensed a quiet anticipation that did not exist on ordinary days. Men moved more slowly, as if not wanting to break whatever it was that made the morning feel almost gentle. The guards were present, performing their duties, but even their movements seemed less hurried, less weighed down by the demands of their posts. As the prisoners approached the kitchen area, a richer scent began to drift through the air. It was a faint shift at first, a slight deepening of the usual aroma that came from the large pots simmering over the stoves. But soon the difference became unmistakable. The broth was thicker, the smell of fat and seasoning more distinct, and the steam rising from the pots came in heavier billows, catching the chilly light in a way that made it almost glow. When the cooks lifted the lids, the fragrance spread across the camp like a warm cloud, and even those who tried to appear indifferent felt something stir inside. The special ration for Christmas was small, but it felt larger than it was because of what it represented. The addition of canned meat and crushed biscuits, supplied in part by the Red Cross, transformed the thin soup into something that reminded the men of meals they once took for granted. When the cooks ladled the soup into metal bowls, the sound of liquid hitting the steel rang through the cold air with a kind of gentle promise. Many of the prisoners held their bowls carefully, as if afraid the warmth might escape too quickly. Friedrich felt the heat seep into his hands and rise through his arms, and for a moment it brought a sting to his eyes. The steam blurred the faces of the men around him, turning their hardened expressions into softer shapes that seemed almost unfamiliar. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, allowing the warmth to fill the places inside them that had grown hollow over weeks of hunger. The meal did not erase their worries or lift the weight of captivity, but it created a small space where the burden felt lighter. Some men allowed themselves to smile, others simply closed their eyes while swallowing, letting the warmth spread through them. It was not joy exactly, but a brief gentleness that felt almost like a blanket placed over a cold memory. After finishing his soup, Friedrich sat with his empty bowl for a moment, not wanting the experience to end too quickly. The warmth still clung to the metal, and he held it until the cold eventually reclaimed it. The afternoon passed, in a calm that felt different from the usual stillness of the camp. People spoke more freely, though still quietly. Small groups gathered near the barracks to share stories or simply stand in the weak sunlight. The guards walked their rounds with steady steps, but there were moments when they seemed to pause without reason, looking across the camp as if lost in thoughts of their own. One guard standing near a tower hummed part of a Christmas hymn, not loudly, not with any sense of performance, but softly enough that anyone passing close by could hear the familiar rise and fall of the tune. The real surprise came later, when the light began to fade and the shadows stretched long across the snow. Friedrich was near one of the posts marking the limits of the camp when he saw a young American guard walking along his usual patrol route. There was nothing unusual in his appearance. He carried his rifle slung across his shoulder, and his boots crunched in the snow with each step. The cold had reddened his cheeks, and he walked with a kind of practiced alertness that came from long hours on duty. But as he reached a quieter corner of the fence, he slowed and glanced around in a way that suggested he was checking the area not for danger, but to be sure the moment was his alone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small burlap bag. It was tied loosely at the top and looked worn, as if it had been handled many times before being brought here. The guard placed the bag at the base of the wooden post, not on the prisoner's side, but close enough that anyone looking from inside the wire could see it clearly. He adjusted the position of the bag, nudging it slightly with his glove until its contents peeked out just enough to be recognized. Then, without lingering, he straightened, shifted his rifle back into place, and resumed his patrol in the same measured rhythm as before. The entire act took only a few seconds, but it carried a weight that rippled quietly through the nearby prisoners. At first, no one approached the bag. Some men watched from a distance, unsure whether it was allowed to look closely or whether this was some kind of test. A few whispered to one another, but even their whispers were hushed, as if afraid to disturb the small mystery resting at the foot of the post. Finally, one prisoner stepped forward, moving with caution and stopping just before the boundary. He leaned down slightly, keeping his hands carefully at his sides, and peered into the open top of the bag. After a moment, he straightened and gave a small nod to the men behind him, a nod that conveyed neither excitement nor fear, but a simple truth. The bag contained no trick, no hidden danger, only food, real food. Inside were a few pieces of sugar, several hard biscuits, and a small packet of coffee powder. The items were modest, the kind that could easily be overlooked in a well-supplied unit. Yet to starving prisoners, they looked like treasures. After a few seconds, the men approached one by one, taking only a little each. There was no pushing, no grabbing. The exchange happened in silence, almost reverence, as if speaking might break whatever fragile thing had just been created. Friedrich received a single small cube of sugar. He placed it in his mouth and let it rest on his tongue without biting. Slowly, it softened, releasing a sweetness he had almost forgotten existed. For a few moments he felt his chest tighten with a mix of gratitude and pain, the kind of feeling that comes when something lost is suddenly returned, even briefly. Later that evening, the prisoners decided to respond in their own way. There was no discussion, no plan announced, no instruction given. It happened because several men simply felt compelled to act. One placed a piece of dark bread wrapped in cloth near the same post. Another left a hand-rolled cigarette. A third offered a small carved piece of wood, its edges uneven, but shaped with care. These were humble gifts, taken from the little they had, but they carried a quiet dignity. They were not intended to match the value of what had been received, but to acknowledge the gesture, to say, without words, that kindness had been noticed and returned. Night arrived with a subtle shift in the wind, and soon snow began to fall again. At first it drifted gently, swirling in soft flakes that caught the light from the lamps strung along the wires. But the softness quickly gave way to a heavier storm. The flakes grew larger and fell faster, and the wind pushed them sideways, filling the air with a dense flurry that made it difficult to see more than a few paces ahead. The guard towers stood like dim shapes in a world turned white, and the wooden barracks creaked under the growing weight gathering on their roofs. Inside the huts, men lay awake listening to the storm. Snow hissed against the walls, and the wind howled through the cracks. The storm did not just bring cold, it brought a sense of unease, as if the camp itself were groaning beneath the force of nature. A sudden shout came from one of the towers, muffled by the wind but clear enough to draw the attention of the guards. The fence on the northern side of the camp had begun to lean. The posts closest to the wind bent under the pressure of the snow piling against them, and one section sagged lower. With each passing minute, several American soldiers rushed toward the fence, their boots sinking deep into the snow with each step. They tried to brace the leaning posts, driving new supports into the ground, but the storm made their work difficult. Wind pushed them back, snow blinded them, and each attempt to lift the heavy wires seemed to require more strength than the last. From inside the barracks, prisoners watched the shapes moving through the storm. At first, they simply observed. The fence was, after all, what kept them inside. But as they saw the guards struggling and the posts bending further, something changed in the way the prisoners looked at one another. If the fence collapsed, the consequences would not be simple or favorable. A break in the perimeter would lead to stricter regulations, harsher checks, and the possibility of relocation to places even further from comfort or safety. Beyond that, the collapse itself could bring injury to anyone nearby, guard or prisoner. The storm did not care about uniforms or sides. It cared only about weight and pressure and the force that built as snow gathered in heavy drifts. One prisoner stepped outside, then another, and another. Soon a small group formed, moving into the storm with their arms raised to shield their faces from the biting wind. They walked toward the inside of the leaning fence, using whatever tools they could find. Some carried pieces of broken wood, others held bent sheets of metal, and many used their bare hands. They cleared snow from the base of the fence, pushing it away in large heaps, working with a determination that came not from orders, but from instinct and necessity. More prisoners joined them, forming a line that stretched along the sagging section. Their breath rose in thick clouds that immediately vanished into the storm. The guards tensed when they first saw the movement, but it quickly became clear that the prisoners were not trying to escape. They were trying to keep the fence standing. The Americans continued their efforts from the outside, driving posts deeper into the frozen ground, while the prisoners cleared snow from within. For a moment, uniforms blurred into nothing more than shapes in the storm, all bent against the same wind, all fighting the same force that threatened the camp. The storm raged for hours. Snow piled on shoulders, gathered in hair, and froze onto eyelashes. Hands went numb and feet grew heavy, but the men continued. They worked because stopping meant surrendering to the storm, and none of them, not guards, not prisoners, wanted to see the camp buried or broken. When the wind finally began to ease and the snow's fury waned, the fence still stood. The posts leaned slightly, showing the strain of the night, but they held. The barracks remained upright. No one cheered. The men were too tired, too wet, too cold, but beneath the exhaustion was a shared understanding that something significant had occurred. By dawn, the storm had passed. A thick silence settled over the camp, broken only by the distant call of a guard completing his rounds. Prisoners emerged from their barracks slowly, blinking at the pale morning light. The snow lay deep and untouched in many places, sparkling faintly where the early sun reached it. The damaged section of the fence stood as a quiet reminder of the night's labor. Some of the guards glanced toward the prisoners with expressions that were not easy to interpret. They were not exactly softer, not exactly warmer, yet they carried a depth that had not been there before. The day returned to its routine, but the routine felt changed, as if a thin layer of something unseen had settled over the camp. Later that morning, a wooden box appeared near the back door of the kitchen. It was not written into any rule, not ordered by any officer, yet it sat there with its lid slightly open, revealing small scraps of bread and broken pieces of biscuits. These were not fresh rations. They were leftovers, set aside rather than thrown away. The prisoners noticed, and though they said nothing, they found ways to respond. Bits of dry wood, small bundles of twigs, anything that could serve as fuel were placed neatly near the same spot. It was a quiet exchange, one that neither side acknowledged openly, but it continued in the days that followed. These small interactions did not erase the realities of war. They did not make the wire disappear or lift the weight of captivity, but they created a fragile thread of understanding, woven through shared hardship and brief moments of silent cooperation. The prisoners and guards remained on opposite sides of the fence, yet the storm had revealed that human instinct sometimes bends the barriers built by conflict, and in the cold winter of 1944, that recognition, subtle, unspoken, and easily overlooked, became one of the few sources of warmth that the men carried with them into the uncertain days ahead. When the storm was finally behind them, and the camp returned to its rigid structure of routines, the memory of that night lingered in a way that none of the men could fully explain. It was not spoken about during roll call or whispered across bunks in the darkness. Little was said about it at all, yet the events lived in the expressions that passed between prisoners and guards, in the small pauses before a command was issued, in the quiet acknowledgement when eyes met across the wire. Something had shifted, not in the rules of the camp but in the way the men sensed one another's presence. The storm had shown that survival, for a moment, depended on shared labor rather than opposition. No formal agreement had been reached, no truce declared, yet a wordless understanding had been born in the snow. The routine of the camp resumed. Men rose at dawn to the sound of the whistle, stepped into the cold air, and lined up for counting. The soup at breakfast was thin again, the piece of bread small, the day filled with the same long hours of waiting, thinking, and remembering. Work details formed and dispersed. The guards continued their patrols, rifles carried at the ready. Nothing in the daily operation of the camp suggested that anything unusual had taken place, yet there were subtle differences. A guard might linger a moment longer near a group of prisoners, not out of suspicion but out of a quiet curiosity. A prisoner might nod faintly when passing near a guard he had shoveled snow beside during the storm. Such gestures were small enough to be missed, but they accumulated like grains of sand, forming a fragile layer over the hard surface of war. Friedrich noticed these changes most clearly during the quieter hours of the afternoon, when the sun reached its highest point but gave little warmth. Men sat outside the barracks, leaning against the wooden walls or crouching near the few patches of sunlight that made the cold slightly more bearable. In these moments he sometimes found himself thinking not only of home but of the guard who had left the burlap bag, of the soldiers who had struggled against the storm, and of the way men who had been enemies for years had worked side by side without speaking. He wondered what had gone through the guard's mind when he placed the bag by the fence, whether it had been a spontaneous gesture or something he had considered for days. He wondered if the guard had someone back home who hoped he would show kindness where possible, or if the act had come from some instinct that needed no guidance. At times, Friedrich felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for the small kindness that had entered the camp on a cold evening. Sorrow for the fact that such kindness felt rare enough to be almost startling. He realized that war had stripped away many ordinary things, reshaping simple human gestures into acts that felt profound. A piece of sugar, a shared struggle against nature, a returned offering of bread or wood. These had become symbols of something larger than the moment itself. They represented the parts of humanity that war tried to bury, but could not entirely erase. As January wore on, and the snow thickened in layers over the roofs of the barracks, rumors began to circulate through the camp. Some said the front was collapsing for Germany. Others believed that the Allies were pushing deeper into the homeland. Many prisoners felt torn between fear and hope, knowing that the end of the war might be approaching but unsure of what that ending would bring for them. Some feared being moved, others feared being forgotten, and others still feared returning to a home that might no longer exist. Each rumor carried its own weight, shaping the mood of the camp in unpredictable ways. Eventually, an announcement confirmed what many had suspected. Some prisoners would be transferred to larger, more permanent camps further from the front. The temporary facility in Belgium would be reorganized, and the men currently held there would be separated, sorted into groups based on rank, health, and labor capacity. Friedrich's name appeared among those scheduled for transfer. When he heard it read aloud, he felt a tightening in his chest that he did not immediately understand. He told himself himself that the move was neither unusual nor threatening, that it might even bring slightly better conditions or more predictable routines. Yet the thought of leaving the camp, the place where the storm had taken place and where he had felt a brief moment of meaning amid the bitterness of captivity, stirred an unexpected sadness. On the morning of the transfer, the snow had begun to melt, turning the ground into patches of slush and mud. The air carried the smell of thawing earth. Friedrich and the other selected prisoners gathered their belongings, which amounted to very little: a blanket, a cup, a small bundle of clothing tied together with twine. When the guards called his group forward, he stepped into the line and began walking toward the truck that would take them away. Before climbing aboard, he turned back for a moment and looked across the camp. The barracks stood in their familiar rows, the watchtowers at each corner, the fence that had both confined and protected them. The damaged section from the storm had been repaired, but he could still see the slight difference in color where new wood had been used. He thought of the sugar melting on his tongue, the warmth of the Christmas soup in his hands, the breathless effort of pushing snow in the freezing darkness, and the quiet exchanges of bread and wood that followed. He thought of the guard who had placed the bag near the fence. Then he climbed onto the truck without speaking. The road away from the camp wound through fields that were slowly emerging from beneath the winter snow. Patches of brown earth showed through, and in the distance trees stood like dark silhouettes against the pale sky. As the truck moved forward, Friedrich felt the weight of uncertainty press against him. He did not know where he was being taken, or what the next camp would be like. He did not know when the war would end, or how his life would unfold once it did. Yet in the midst of this uncertainty, the memory of the storm and the small acts of kindness that followed remained steady inside him, a point of stillness in a landscape filled with shifting shadows. In the months and years that came after the war, many former prisoners wrote their memories down. Some wrote about the hunger, the cold, the fear, and the humiliations of captivity. Others wrote about the strange routines that shaped their days, or the emotional numbness that came from living in a place where time seemed suspended. A few wrote about moments of unexpected humanity, those fragile seconds when the barrier between enemy and enemy seemed to thin, allowing something else to pass through. Friedrich found himself among the latter. He did not deny the hardship of captivity, nor did he pretend that kindness erased the larger cruelty of war, but he could not forget the sugar placed quietly by the fence, the shared effort against the storm, or the silent exchange of gifts and wood in the days that followed. These were not grand gestures, and they did not change the outcome of the war, yet they remained with him long after the larger events had faded into dates and names in a history book. Years later, when Friedrich tried to describe the significance of those small moments, he found that words often felt too heavy or too grand for what had happened. He realized that the meaning did not lie in the objects themselves, the sugar cube, the wood, the biscuits, but in what they represented. They were reminders that even in the harshest conditions, humans carry within them the potential for compassion, not because they are ordered to show it, not because doing so changes the course of battle, but because something within them refuses to let the war define them completely. He came to believe that this instinct, fragile though it may be, was one of the last defenses against the kind of hatred that could otherwise consume a person from the inside. He often thought about how the world tended to remember wars. Histories focused on generals, strategies, weapons, and victories. Maps showed lines advancing and retreating, arrows pointing toward decisive moments. Numbers appeared in charts, listing the dead, the wounded, the missing. Yet, behind those numbers were faces, voices, and small stories that did not make it into official reports. Friedrich believed that these stories, even if told only in brief lines in a memoir or shared quietly among loved ones, helped shape a different understanding of what war truly meant. They anchored the vastness of conflict in the simple truth that every soldier, every prisoner, every guard was a human being before he was anything else. In time, Friedrich came to see that peace was not created solely by treaties or by the laying down of arms. It was built slowly, in moments when individuals chose not to surrender to hatred, when they resisted the pull of bitterness and found a way to acknowledge the humanity of someone they had been taught to fear. The camp had been a place of confinement, but it had also been a place where he saw that hostility could weaken, not through grand gestures but through small acts that seemed almost insignificant, whether it was clearing snow in a storm or sharing a scrap of food on a cold evening. These moments suggested that peace began at the most basic level, in the simple recognition that no one is untouched by suffering. As he grew older, Friedrich sometimes spoke of those winter days with a kind of quiet reverence, not because they were pleasant, but because they revealed revealed something about the human spirit that he carried with him for the rest of his life. He remembered the guards' faces blurred by falling snow, the feel of frozen wood beneath his hands, the taste of sugar melting on his tongue, the soft hum of a Christmas hymn drifting from a watchtower. These memories became part of how he understood the war, not as a series of victories and losses, but as a long chain of days where individuals made choices that either deepened the darkness or offered a small light against it. When Friedrich looked back across the distance of years, he understood that the storm did not change history. It did not shorten the war or alter its final outcome, but it changed him. And it changed, in quiet ways, the men who stood beside him, both prisoners and guards. It taught them that the line separating enemies could blur when faced with a force that cared nothing for battles or borders, and that in those moments what remained was the simple truth of shared humanity. It taught him that even in the coldest winter, compassion could still stir like a faint warmth, refusing to be extinguished. And so when he was asked later in life what he remembered most about that difficult winter, he did not speak first of the hunger or the cold or the fear. He spoke of the sugar in the burlap bag. He spoke of the men who cleared the snow in silence. He spoke of the uneasy, fragile understanding that passed between the two sides like a breath carried on the wind, because in the end, those small moments, barely noticed by the world at large, were the ones that shaped the way he came to understand war and the way he came to believe in peace.